Hello and welcome to Spooking from Ignorance, the Halloween special. I'm Daniel. I'm an astrophysics student at the University of Edinburgh, the spookiest of universities. And with me today is...
I am Jack, a professional development coach and a charity sector worker.
I'm Sid. I'm also an astrophysics PhD student in Heidelberg.
I am Dracula. No, I'm not. I was attempting to go for a Bela Lugosi sort of voice there. It didn't go very well. I am Henry Holmes. Of course, the podcast's resident actor to balance out the physicists. Yes, and our guest this week, if you would care to introduce yourself.
My name's Charlotte Baker. I'm an associate lecturer, PhD student in film and television, and an author from Derby. Well, Derbyshire now. I've just moved.
Oh, where have you moved to? Well, maybe that's not wise to put it out.
I think I'm asking for a stalker if I was to do that exactly.
Today, like Daniel said, it is spooking from ignorance.
Yes, this is Halloween.
Yeah.
It is the season to be spooky.
Do we want to just dive right in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I've got, the sort of like the attraction of gore and horror. I guess broadly that would be horror film and then also books. You yourself are an author, so you probably have a lot of expertise in that avenue. And then also like video games. It's just sort of everywhere in pop culture. I mean, even just Halloween, right? Just the idea of horror, being scared, that sort of stuff. So at a base level, what is the attraction of gore and horror to maybe the human mind, psyche? I don't know any of these words.
I mean, to be honest, I think the instinct is to go with morbid curiosity, but I think that only gets you so far, which I suppose is where everything that I do kind of ties together, if you like, because I do look at film and television, and I look at, obviously I write novels, so I read a lot and I'm interested in literature. And quite often the two, the biggest thing about it is really the story, and the attraction. Yes, is partly because of the story, but also there is this element of gore, as you mentioned. But I don't think it tends to come along as part of the whole process. It's part of it, and I think there is that element of morbid curiosity, but I think there's also this element of the context in which the gore and the sort of nasty, disgusting stuff is kind of contextualised in the wider context. There is, for example, if a little boy was to fall off his bike and break his arm, and his arm was to be kind of like facing the wrong way, you'd be like, oh my goodness, and you'd be straight there helping, hopefully, and supporting.
Yeah, hopefully.
And actually that same arm could be, that same sort of contorted, distorted arm could be the exact same in a horror movie that had been, where an arm had been forcibly, violently kind of manipulated to that position. So that level of violence is completely different to the boy falling off of his bike. But actually the two are exactly the same. You've still got this kind of arm that's horrifically broken and whatever. It's the context in which it's read that changes things, that makes us more disgusted. We're not disgusted by a lad falling off his bike and breaking his arm. These things happen. But when you put it in a context of torture or violence or whatever else, where there's something's forcibly done to somebody, it changes the response, if you like. And it's not necessarily, it's not the gore that does it in that sense. It's the story. It's the story that changes our response, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Is that? Do you think that's because rather than it just being an accident, it now is a deliberate act by somebody, committed by an intelligence or by a force, and it's like it becomes a deliberate act as opposed to just an unfortunate accident?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of pulled down to the story of why would somebody do that, or why has that happened even. But I think the attraction of gore is there's kind of different aspects. I said that there's that morbid curiosity, which I think will take you to some extent, and then there's this idea of story and the way in which we need an answer for things, and the psychology of it, and the psychology of what we're witnessing, both as people who are witnessing it and the people it's happening to. We're interested in both sides. or I am anyway. That's what I do. I look at how people respond to these things. So I'm fascinated by that, and I think that kind of pulls us in. We want to see why people do these things or how they respond. There's things like on YouTube that are kind of haunted, particularly with celebrities going around haunted houses and watching Ariana Grande scream as a dressed up alien scares it half to death. That's really widely viewed, and partly probably because it's her, but also because we like to watch other people's reaction to these quite stressful situations. So I think there's kind of multiple layers of how it attracts people, both being directly related to it and being involved in it, but also the response of others to it as well. But yeah, I think there's it all kind of ties back to the emotion of it, I suppose. I think we all, to an extent, like to be scared. And by being scared, what that does is it actually reinforces your safety. So if you were to go into a cinema and watch a scary film, which I'm sure a lot of people would be doing round about now, had it not been for the current circumstances, you go in and you've got this kind of yon and it's you watching this film, and you feel kind of isolated and quite scared. But when you leave, you get up and you return to the real world, and you realise that, do you know what, I'm in a lot better position than those people on screen, because I'm safe. No axe murderers chasing me. Things are pretty good. I'm all right, and it actually works to reinforce that element of safety, I think, as well.
And do you think that maybe appeals to us because we also know on a certain level that it is fantasy, as opposed to, when you watch the news and you see terrible things happening in the world in other countries where you go, oh, that could happen. Whereas, like if somebody's being killed by a vampire or Freddy Krueger or, any of these characters, you just go, that's not real. So you can sort of separate yourself from that.
I think you can, yeah. And I think actually when you watch stuff or you're engaged in stuff that's scary, you let that barrier down because you want to be scared. So you do feel as if it's almost like not necessarily a personal attack on you, but as close to that act as you can possibly get. But there's also that safety that it's not you. Really, it's not you, and you can remove yourself at any point. And I think that helps people kind of deal with. Well, for me, for example, the reason I like horror is because when I'm really stressed and things aren't going particularly well, I can watch a horror film and think my life's considerably better than theirs, which makes me feel better about things.
It's sort of a Schadenfreude kind of thing.
Yeah. So it does make you feel a bit better. And you do escape, and you do, you're back into the like you said, that reality that actually, although it gives you an element of escapism, I suppose that's what I'm getting at, that element of escapism that allows you to become close, allows you to become scared in a situation that is safe.
Do you guys like horror films?
Yeah.
I'm not someone who likes horror films, unfortunately.
Can I ask why?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this recently, not just because of the podcast, but because a lot of my friends have been playing a game called Phasmophobia. I'm not sure if people have heard of it. But in the game, you're a group of sort of ghost hunters. This is very clearly paranormal. And you go into a house, and it just... You put on, your headphones, and then it's, the classic sort of spooky house noises with, this grainy noise filter. And the idea is you're going around and you actually speak in the game. The game detects your voice pickup, and you call out to the ghost to give you a sign. And it's kind of just like all of these ghost hunter shows, but as a game. And then at some point, the ghost can come and hunt the people there. But there's something about that game where I just don't play horror games. There's something I don't like being scared. And I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. The idea of... But it might be... Because another thing is I don't really watch films. I prefer a lot of active engagement and I don't know. I guess I like having agency. So it might be that sitting in a horror film, it is more that I feel like I can't escape. But I don't know. It's interesting. I just don't really like those sort of jump scare horror films. Although with the sort of slow roll bit, I'm better. That doesn't really.
You're certainly not on your own. I know probably more people who feel the way you do than I do. I do find it fascinating how people respond to horror, because I think it does very much split people. It's always yes or no, and actually why that reaction is very interesting. Yeah,
it's like Marmite.
It is 100%. Yeah.
Is there a correlation?
Between people who like Marmite and people who like horror.
Yeah.
Funny enough, that's my new project.
As a sort of disclaimer, Sid isn't a massive film fan, but you do like Richard McLean's podcast.
Yes, that's true.
Unexplained, which is basically just ghost stories.
It's a bit more than ghost stories, though, because he's also talking about, like, human psychology. What I like about that is the delving into the unknown from a safe distance, I guess. No, but I really like the way he's just talking about unexplained occurrences over history and the way he can weave a story together. And sometimes it's paranormal. Sometimes it is, like, horrific. And there are times where, I think he did a Halloween special, where it is just a ghost story. And that sort of stuff I actually really like. I think the main thing I don't like is jump scares.
I can understand that. Like I said, none of my family really like horror. My boyfriend doesn't like horror. So yeah, I'm a bit on my own in that sense. But I think, again, you mentioned psychology, and to me, it's all to do with psychology. It's all to do with,
Definitely.
As a writer, it's kind of. I always say when I teach horror, when I teach crime, what your job is as a writer is essentially to be able to make somebody who's all tucked up in a little like onesie with a nice fluffy blanket and a nice of hot chockey, all nice and cozy and safe. You want to make them terrified, and that's your job. And you have to manipulate somebody's emotions to be able to do that and manipulate the way that they feel. Like that's what it boils down to. It's all to do with people's psychology, characters' psychology, motivations, stuff like that. Actually, when it all comes together and it works, it's incredible. And actually, the experience of watching something like that is equally incredible, or reading something like that. I think that, and that's what I love about it, is kind of working out how to create or to read something if I'm studying, to kind of connect the dots to understand either why somebody has created it in this way and the ways in which it plays with genre or whatever, or actually how to create it myself and for it to be effective. But I suppose on the flip side that it's all individual. What everyone finds scary is different. Your jump scares as an example. Some people find things like the paranormal aspects a little bit too far. Some people find found footage, which is like, when it's like handheld cameras and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Blair Witch projects and stuff like
Exactly,
that.
Yeah. Exactly, which, people don't always agree with because it's a bit too real. So there's different limits of what is scary, I suppose, and what people fear. And for me, real life is far scarier than any ghost that haunts the staircase or anything, Ghostbusters, anything. I just find real life terrifying. Every day is just so scary.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, no, we can't recognise the monsters. People are the monsters. No, I think you're right. I think real life is much scarier.
Yeah, we're living through a little bit of a horror film.
I mean, I've seen some horror films out there, and they are pretty scary, especially those like Japanese, Korean ones. They are terrifying. As a sort of outsider looking in, it does seem to me that there's some sort of big boom in horror recently. So you have American Horror Story, which has become really, really popular. Haunting of Hill House, Haunting of Bly Manor. Can't even think of anything else. You also have like occurrences of like the paranormal into other shows which are strictly horror. So for example, BBC Ghosts. And yeah, like I'm just wondering if you think the paranormal and horror in general is going to be more popular in the sort of next coming years. Is this like a trend, or is this just something which I've noticed, or is this just new to me basically?
I think there is definitely something happening with horror at the moment and I think it's primarily television. I think it's television specific in terms of the way the access, people have access to it. So for example, if you think more than a few years ago, but at one point, if you wanted to watch a horror film, you either had to go to Blockbuster, you had to go to the cinema, you had to...
Oh wow, this is a while ago.
Back in the day.
Heady days of Blockbuster.
So, you're going to have to go somewhere out of your comfort zone out of your immediate comfort zone, out of your bubble of safety, to actually get access to horror. There was very little on television. And then things, I think, that kind of started my obsession with horror was things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. From that point on, things change. And actually, with the television and it being in the domestic space and the domestic setting, the access of it, all that kind of stuff, I think that's changed. And then obviously add on to that streaming and streaming services and the access of stuff you can get now, fairly cheap, few pound per month. Actually, you can have a wide range of stuff given to you. So I think that's partly why you're seeing this this boom, is because of the streaming services, and the quality of those shows on those streaming services is incredible. Personally, I think.
Yeah, you can see that in Netflix's debt. That's interesting. It's interesting that you say it's sort of TV specific as well. Do you think that? Why do you think that is, as opposed to more horror
Kids
films
these days.
coming out?
Not reading, that's why.
I think it's again a couple of reasons. I think horror has kind of, I think, again, developed this kind of understanding of this cinematic artistry, how beautiful it can be, and then you have things like The Haunting of Hill House and Hannibal that are beautifully shot, as engaging, and you can again stay in your slippers and your PJs with whatever snack you want, and you don't have to leave your house, and you're getting this cinematic beauty that I think that's part of the reason that that it's becoming more common and becoming more spoken about, because they're reaching those cinematic standards of storytelling, of complexity, of artistry, and all the rest of it, really.
You mentioned a couple times, I guess even just now, that you can just stay at home and be really comfortable. But before, you were saying that the point of writing sort of horror novels and stories is being able to pull the reader out of their safe zone and make them really empathize with the situation. How do you do that?
A good question. If anyone's got the answer, please email in.
How maybe you have some specific examples from your own writing, or like just some scenarios. There obviously isn't some general formula of how to do it, but how would you sort of set the scene in a way that for that brief moment that reader feels like they are in the story?
Yeah. So I think there's multiple things related to it, and I think what I was saying before about the being in your PJs at home type thing, I think that changes the access. So that's the difference, is we have more people watching it or engaging in horror text because the access has changed. The safety aspect, and that feeling safe, still stays the same. You still have to scare people no matter where they are, in a darkened cinema or at home. You still have to make them terrified. And I think that's a lot to do with atmosphere. And again, a lot to do with character. If you look at The Haunting of Hill House, I think that is, for me, it's possibly my favourite. And I think the way that it's constructed as a ghost story and as a kind of a haunting story, if you like, but also as the way in which it creates characters that you are emotionally attached to pretty quickly, that's what draws you in, because you're so emotionally invested and engaged with these characters that when bad things start to happen, you start to think, if they can happen to those characters that are so similar to me, they can happen to me as well. And I think that's at that point, when you cross that line, you have to build and formulate that character well. And when you've created that character, you then have to have something bad happen to them that you can then relate to your own world and think, oh my goodness, if it can happen to them, it can happen to anybody. And I think as soon as you cross that line, you've got them.
As a sort of piece of homework, I did go and watch Haunting of Hill House. I am only on episode 8 though, so no late season spoilers, please. But there are some shots in there which are just beautifully filmed, and the sort of camera work and how it shifts and how it pans in to make it feel very claustrophobic, and I don't know, things just pop out of nowhere. It is incredibly well made. So if anyone here hasn't watched it, I would sort of recommend. And I've been watching so far, and I think I've only counted 3 jump scares in the entire thing. So I don't think you should be too adverse if you aren't a fan of jump scares. It is more just slow reveals of something like horrific that has happened, rather than something scary.
Yeah, and I do think it's brilliant. I absolutely love it, and I think that the other thing is it comes from Shirley Jackson's novel, but it's actually nothing like that. You know, Shirley Jackson's novel is about three strangers who go to a haunted house, and actually, The Haunting of Hill House is about a family. And that, you know, my research is kind of on how women engage with horror and how women are interested in and engage and identify with these texts. And I think this is probably why I'm such a fan of this text, is because the way it speaks to women in particular is really quite fascinating. It changes the story. So rather than it being three strangers, it's actually about a family and siblings. And the way that those characters again are created are very, very, very effective. It starts off basically the text itself is about a family who have to come together after the death of a sister, and the ways in which they begin to kind of recommunicate again and start from fresh and have to, you know, deal with this incredibly traumatic event. But each episode has a character focus. So each episode has one character that they'll follow through and they'll kind of trace them. And it starts off with Steve, who is the eldest. He's the expert. He's sat in somebody's house telling them that, you know, ghosts aren't real. You're being a little bit irrational. Don't be so daft. All that kind of stuff. Which again, if you trace it back, that's what a lot of Gothic fiction kind of is looking at, the way in which women are treated at those certain times. If you really trace Gothic fiction back, it's primarily looking at women's experiences. So to start off with this guy going, you know, you're being irrational, being illogical, ghosts aren't real. We kind of go, goodness, right, we're listening now, okay. And we take him as the expert. And then every single episode after that, he is undermined in various situations. He's presented in that first one as the expert in charge. And actually, he's got no money. He's a coward. He's a liar. As you go through, he's kind of very much undermined, and he functions quite heavily to rewrite, if you like, that kind of female voice, if you like. The whole text is prioritising women's voices and women's character and this range of different kinds of women on screen. And again, he functions really to kind of highlight that this, basically that he's built his career as this expert, and actually underneath it all he's just a coward. And through my research, I did some stuff online. It's ethnographic research where I'm looking at people's responses to character, and no one likes him.
So sad.
I think that's a sign of a great audience, like, because you know you're doing it right. If nobody's supposed to like you and nobody likes you, you're going, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And no one really does like him. And it's very well played. Again, this is something else that interests me, is the way that that's structured. You believe him because he's the only guy you've got to take any understanding of this narrative world. You've only got him. So you're relying on his point of view and his perspective for you to then build up an understanding of this world. And then in the second episode, it pulls that apart and actually exposes the reality of the situation, which is that actually the primary story is examining how this family responds, and the lead, I suppose, if you like, is Shirley, who is the second oldest, but in many ways far more practical and able and capable than the one who was put in charge originally, her brother.
Interesting.
I think in like a lot of paranormal horror, there is like a big connection between, well, there is just like there is a lot of reference to like mental health and sort of mental disorders, right? And yeah, I do feel like there is that sort of, I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say here, but yeah, I think that a lot of those characters are really, really terrified of just not being believed and stuff. And I was reading recently about ovarian cysts and how women who are trying to work out what's wrong with them, you know, each month when they're experiencing horrible pains, and they're trying to work out what's going on, right? But yeah, like they are quite often like dismissed and they don't get a diagnosis, and having no one believe them is really like scary and disheartening. And as soon as they're able to find a doctor who does believe them, it's like an instant relief, which is very similar to like what I was seeing when I was watching, Haunting of Hill House, because it's like a very similar thing. So I can see how you've like pulled these two things together. They are very similar things.
Yeah, definitely, and I think
I'm not sure I'm going
as well that no, and I think it's really interesting. I think the fact that it's clear that Nell in particular is struggling. But what's particularly interesting for me is that it's the responses to Nell. So she tries to contact every member of her family before she goes back to the haunted house. And actually, that response and the guilt that they carry from not picking up that phone call because they're too busy with a bit of housework, or because they're too busy, sorting out something else, and that moment that she required them and they weren't there. How they also deal with that is very telling, but again, very relatable. All of them deal with it in different ways. One goes down addiction, one is furious, very angry. One is very practical. We'll sort this out. Again, it's very representative of grief, I think, and responsibility and all those things of what if. So I just think the way the formation of these characters and the way it deals with really traumatic incidents and really kind of heartbreaking circumstances is really telling, and it really, again, emotionally very much engages me. And I very much feel for all these characters. And then you throw in to that the bent neck lady, which I think is one of the most terrifying, genuinely scary things I have ever seen. And I'm not scared, so I've told you, real life scares me. So bent neck lady, no bother. I'll be absolutely fine. Was genuinely terrified, and I can also say that numerous people I know were also genuinely terrified of it. So to have that balance of enabling people to be genuinely scared of something, but also to have that kind of balance of people who, characters that are complex, well-formed, realistic, and have this kind of underlying conversation about men and women and gender and all the rest of it, and sexuality and everything else, to be able to combine that together in a piece so effectively for each of those categories was brilliant, I thought.
Great show.
Yeah, it's interesting because it completely disproves that idea that horror is just a series of, jump scares and people, it shows that you can explore deep, complicated, philosophical and relationship based ideas through this, because, it's that classic idea of, people being thrown together in trauma and you find out who these people really are. And if anything, I think horror is probably quite an effective medium for exploring that. So it's interesting that it isn't more respected in the way that it can do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's changing. I think that respect is changing. But again, that shared trauma, it's horror, isn't it? You've got that again, it ties down for me for the way people relate to things and engage with things, that emotion, and to have that emotional attachment and investment in these characters to then witness these horrendous things. And again, the way in which it brings them together. It starts off that they're all leading their own little lives. And actually quite independently so, and quite successfully so. They don't really need each other until this death brings them together, and they have to begin to reconfigure their relationships and really reconfigure their own identities. Who are they outside of this family, and who are they in this family? What is their role? Are they the person, are they the baby? Are they the eldest? Or, Steve, for example, Steve being the eldest, the responsibility automatically falls to him, who he rejects it, and it ends up being Shirley. So, it's all about identity and who you are through shared trauma. You can only know who you are in relation to who's around you, I think. And I think horror does that very well.
I feel like as a human race, we have been telling ghost stories for a really, really long time now. And I feel like every single culture has its own sort of variant of a ghost, or a spirit, or some sort of evil presence, right? Do you think there's something there? Do you believe in spirits? Is there something real here?
Yes, I do, 100%. In very direct terms, yes, I definitely do believe. I think when they're used in popular culture and on screen and things like that, I think often the function of a ghost is to highlight a cultural or social issue, really, or a trauma that exists that, again, is kind of almost coming back on itself. I think it reopens old wounds, and the function of a ghost essentially is to show you your past. And if you have not addressed your past and you haven't faced it, accepted it, etc., you have to now, and you haven't got much of a choice because the ghost will be in front of you. Something as kind of as far back as A Christmas Carol, Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Essentially you have to face what you've done. You have to face your past. You have to address it, accept it, change if that's relevant, and move on. And I don't think that changes between culture. I think that's essentially the same general worldly view, is that quite often ghosts are this kind of their function is to make you address what's happened, what's happening, what you've done, and to accept it, to forgive, all those other things, all those other emotional kind of things, and in some ways move on or move past.
Mm-hmm. It's like the physical manifestation of that idea that's present sort of everywhere, or like in all cultures. It's just how that's maybe manifested is different, how it's described, how we see it in pop culture now.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's an interesting... I hadn't thought about horror in that way before, because it like, do you sort of think that horror is like almost the modern morality tale then, in a sense? The way that ghosts can be used and...
To an extent, yes. I think they very much were in previous kind of films and stuff. If we look at the 80s kind of slasher movement, I think a lot of those films were basically don't do drugs, don't have sex, listen to what your elders tell you, and don't go out after 10.
Yeah, it's the ones who behave who survive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the final girl. I mean, even something like Gremlins, don't feed after, don't get wet, all these kind of rules. It's all about, if you listen to instructions and you take on board what you've been told, you'll be fine. But you have to listen to that authority. You must listen to that authority to survive. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think horror does that at all. In fact, I think it quite often works against those kind of very rigid authorities to negotiate individual identity and freedom and all those other things. Even freedom of expression to an extent. But no, I think there's definitely something about the ways in which horror and fairy tales, for example, are very similar. A lot of Del Toro's stuff has this kind of underlying fantasy fairy tale sort of esque aspect to it. And I think, again, that it's all to do with listening and listening to what your elders have told you and doing the correct thing, and you'll be okay. The underlying rules there, and actually how you break them and how you get out of that. And again, I think in some ways it's to do with growing up and knowing who you are and your identity. And again, I think that's comes down to you as a person, individuals as a person. And I think horror films give you a good way of negotiating who you are and trying to work out your own identity amongst all these other ones, including your 80s slashers that are so strict with authority to more modern ones that are really kind of playing upon it.
So it's kind of like an easy... Because I think I like what you said earlier, where you only know where you are, who you are based on who's around you, including like the situation. And it's really in those stressful situations that you find out your true character. Do you think that horror is maybe a way to do that in a quote unquote safe way, that you're put in this stressful situation and you really realize who you are? For example, even though you're not in that situation, you're confronted with that same faux stress, so to say, if they've done a successful job of taking you out of your safe zone.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, again, ties back to that kind of identity and who you are. And horror does allow you to kind of do things and even try things out. If you think about sort of, again, going back to slashers and things like Carrie, exacting revenge on your bullies. Actually, there's no real payoff. It doesn't work. As much as you might want to have revenge on your bullies and everything else, there is no happy ending to that. You have to kind of grow up and deal with it in a emotionally mature way. You can't use telekinesis to start throwing stuff. That won't work. And even if you did have that power, look what happens to Carrie. So there's this kind of yeah, I do think it gives you opportunities to explore how you feel, and how you're engaging with other people, and how you'd respond to things, and also what you wish you can do. And I think there's a lot of that as well. I think horror enables you to have this space to be able to play out roles that you wouldn't play out in real life, but actually quite often they end up in morally ambiguous or difficult circumstances, and end badly. So, you know, it kind of allows you that safe space to be able to do it, without any kind of sort of real threat. But again, they always tend to end badly.
It sort of comes back round to what you were saying about effective horror always has characters that you identify with, because that I suppose that is the crux of what makes it work. Because if you don't have that, then you don't care when stuff happens to them, and then the whole thing's falling apart. And what do you think about bad horror? Like, you know, examples of horror where it doesn't really work? Because I always find it quite funny, but I'm sort of interested to hear your take.
Yeah, no, I like it. So I find, and I don't know whether it's classified as bad horror, but I find the scary movie films really funny.
Oh yeah.
So, and again, you know, there's nothing particularly horrifying about them. They're just sort of parody. I think it's the parody that I like the most, actually, because obviously I'm a bit of a horror nerd, so like all the little references, and I enjoy finding all of those. But no, I enjoy bad horror, but I do think you're right, and I think even on that level, there still has to be a connection that is built. There still has to be this underlying kind of way in which we engage with them and we identify with them that keeps us going through that story, keeps us wanting to know that they're all right, or what have you. So yeah, I enjoy bad horror, but I also think even the bad horror stuff needs some kind of strong character to pull it through.
Yeah, it's probably a universal truth of drama, probably, isn't it? Probably.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the emotion's the only difference. Whereas with a lot of other drama, you might be looking at trying to sort of emphasise love or commitment or family structures or whatever it is, and build this emotional kind of warmth and happiness and all the rest of it. Horror's just on the opposite end of that scale for me. And it's to kind of make you scared and make you grateful, which it does that for me. I always think, yeah, at least that's not me, and I'm grateful. So at least I think, again, you're exactly right. I think it's just on a sort of on a spectrum.
Writing question. Is there sort of like a quote unquote sweet spot for your target demographic? Because so as a kid, I guess we all had like Goosebumps as the novel series, right? Yeah, because I just remembered that, and I used to read all of them. They're pretty good. And how does
Shout out to Goosebumps.
yeah. How does the writing change based on the target demographic? If it's for sort of younger kids, I guess maybe you have to be more obvious with what the monster or the situation is, even with like Scooby-Doo or stuff like that, which is, you know, the scariest of TV shows. But I guess, yeah. But then this, I haven't watched most horror things, but I'm guessing that when you move sort of like teenagers, young adults, and as you sort of get older, then it's more subliminal. Then you let the viewer or reader fill in the blanks. And I don't know though. What do you think on that?
I think to an extent, definitely. I think that I've written a short kids book that I'm still working on. And the advice, I had somebody help me look over it, and he's a bit of an expert in the field. And I sort of said, you know, what do you think? And he said, yeah, it's good and everything else. But the scary bit of it, I suppose, and this is where, and I can write quite violent, quite transgressive, quite nasty things. But when I was writing that, I was very aware to make the scary, whatever it was that was scary, to try and make it as far removed from reality as possible. So if you think about Goosebumps, which I think is a really good example, they're kind of, you've got dolls that speak and things that are kind of, they're relatable, we understand them, but it's highly unlikely. We're able to kind of, sort of move from that. Whereas I think with adult stuff, it's either one or the other. So normally, the stuff that I've written so far, I will fill in every gory detailed blank that I have to make you feel whatever I want you to feel, and I'll go into the bones and the anatomy and the blood and the gore and all that sort of stuff. The one I'm writing at the moment, there's a lot of fill in the blanks and kind of changes of perspective that mean you have to keep up, if that makes sense. You have to begin to start to understand that there's so many characters from different perspectives, and they all have different opinions of each other. And when I'm writing it from first person, you have to kind of almost get into that zone where you're changing those different perspectives for that character. But no, I think for kids stuff, I always try and keep it understandable, but as far removed from reality as possible. Whereas when it's more adult, I've have no issues with going into huge amounts of detail. But I'm changing at the moment for this book I'm writing in particular. So, but I think I mean, talking of Goosebumps, has anybody watched Are You Afraid of the Dark?
No, sorry.
Oh, you're gonna have to watch that. It's really good. It came out around the same time, and it's all about sort of campfire rumours and stories. You know, kind of. It's really, really interesting. It's a kids program, and it was always set at a campfire, and it kind of was. Well, my cousin's best friend's cousin once said that, and then there's this story, and then the story kind of evaporates into the air, and then it starts. So it's always kind of through hearsay, this kind of urban legend aspect, which I think works so well, because is that not childhood, really? You can say that I'm really a mermaid in year 5, and actually someone will believe you. You know, someone will be like, don't drop any water on her because she's a mermaid, you know. So there's these kind of things, they work really well, and actually it's something that I think is for kids. This idea of hearsay and rumour and, you know, sort of young urban legend, if you like, it works quite well because kids tend to believe that sort of thing. They'll go, oh my goodness, really?
Like, people used to think I was really related to Sherlock Holmes because of my surname.
It is a fantastic name. That is a perfect character name.
People think it's a stage name, and it is, but it's also my real name. What would you say are the 5 most... I mean, you don't have to think too hard about it, but like the 5 pieces of horror that have had the most influence on you as a writer?
Oh, hard question. I suppose early off, anything by Stephen King. Stephen King, for me, I've read a lot of his stuff, and I've read a lot of it twice over with a big 10-year gap. But one of the books that always stays in my head, and this is, again, it's credit to him, was Salem's Lot, which is about a vampire, and I was studying vampires at the time for uni, and I read it, and the vampire doesn't come into the story for maybe 110, 120 pages, and I was thinking, okay, what is keeping me reading here? Because I was sold on a vampire story, and I'm a third of the way through, and the vampire hasn't shown up yet. So what is it that's keeping me reading? And I think Stephen King's got a very good and very unique way of building character, building atmosphere, and particularly flaws, vulnerable kind of components that he really plays upon, which work very well. Because I think that's ultimately the way you identify with your characters is not through their high levels of success and all that sort of stuff. It's through their flaws. You connect through that they're nervous or that they're stressed or that they're even things like driving. You know, if a character doesn't drive, for example, I'm watching Strike at the moment, and I don't drive, and he doesn't drive, and I keep thinking, goodness, you've had this successful business and you don't even drive. And I had that genuine conversation in my head, like, oh wow, he's doing really well for himself. It's not real. But there was something that connected me there to that. So I think that's Stephen King certainly is able to look at people's flaws and use them effectively, both for building identification, the way that you engage with stuff like this, but also his stories are just really, really good. So that would definitely be one. I think I'm going to categorize this as a whole. So sorry for all the fans out there, but all the Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal TV show, that stuff I'm grouping into one. Hannibal Lecter as a character, I've been fascinated by him for years, and I don't think I certainly wouldn't have done my MA without his kind of interest. So he was really a very, very fantastic character, very engaging, did horrendous stuff, and again the books go into huge amounts of detail about what he does and how he does it and all the rest of it. And Hannibal, the TV series, as I mentioned, is absolutely stunning. So I think that was particularly important to me. And I think the last one would be The Haunting of Hill House, which I think for me, particularly because I'm primarily focused on how women experience horror, and being a woman myself, that is just the way in which it's reconfigured the space for a range of different female characters, not just a one-dimensional character who is there to be the victim, who is there to be over-sexualized, who is there to scream at the right point. These very complex characters who have to deal with lots of different things going on in their life, and different things such as business, being a mother, being a family, going through the grieving process, difficulties in understanding your sexuality or your sensitivity, even all these different issues and negotiations you have with yourself as a person. I think to watch that play out and be an effective horror, not a melodrama, not your kind of chick lit type stuff, but to be an effective horror alongside all of that, I think is really, really outstanding.
What do you think?
Sponsored by Hill House.
Yeah, streaming now on
Yeah.
Netflix.
Well, thank you so much for letting me come. I've had an absolute blast.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you. I'm really honoured you asked.
Yeah, I learnt a lot.
Oh, fab. Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm definitely an outsider looking in this episode. Charlotte, do you have any sort of like social medias or books or like websites that you'd like to promo?
Yeah, I mean, if I could send you a few things through that you could maybe put in the link, that would be great.
Yeah.
If that would be okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's it. Otherwise, I think. But no, I really do appreciate your time and being asked. I felt so honoured. So thanks very much.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. This was a great spooky episode. You can find us on Anchor FM, Spotify, video versions on YouTube.
I'm nearly caught up.
Yeah, they're finally here.
You can find us on our website, sfignorance.github.io, because I still have not bought a domain name. Still hosting it for free. Twitter, @FromIgnorance. That's our Twitter handle. There we go. And on Facebook, Speaking From Ignorance is the page. Reach out to us if you've got ideas for who we should speak to next, or thoughts, comments on the show. I think that's everything. Thanks again, Charlotte.
Thank you very much for having me. I've loved it.
It was very fun.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening. See you next week.